The digestive system may also be called the alimentary canal. You may hear it called the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract. And of course, there are also the accessory organs associated with digestion. Those could include the pancreas. They can also include the liver that creates bile and stores it in the gallbladder, and then the gallbladder secretes it into the first segment of the small intestine. So there's quite a few structures that are ultimately involved with the gastrointestinal tract. And we're going to find out that the gastrointestinal tract, that food is going to be entering the oral cavity. We call that process ingestion. And then in the oral cavity, the teeth are going to start the actual process of digestion. When they take off with the first few teeth, the incisors, they cut. Incisors kind of sounds like scissors, and so they cut our food into small pieces, and then we crush the food with the bigger teeth in the back, the molars. And so that's known as mechanical digestion, making something smaller that enters our oral cavity through the ingestion process. But at the same time, we also increase the moisture of the food that we take in the oral cavity. We also lubricate that food with saliva that contains the enzyme amylase, so we actually start chemical digestion in our mouth too. Then when we get into the stomach, we start to have more chemical digestion. There are enzymes involved in our stomach. The hydrochloric acid helps to break the bonds of our food that we ingest. And then as it goes from digestion to the small intestine, we start thinking of absorption occurring in the small intestine. And then throughout the 23 feet or thereabout of the small intestine, after absorption is done taking place, then we're going to see defecation. We're going to get all of the food that's waste that we can't digest. It's going to be compacted into the large intestine, and that's going to be fecal material that we will excrete from the body, but also water conservation goes on in the large intestine. So ultimately, that precious commodity is conserved. And this is an overview of the alimentary canal or the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract. Again, it has many names, but we start in the oral cavity. And the oral cavity is going to contain the tongue. It's also going to have the sublingual salivary glands. Sublingual, of course, means below the tongue. We have the parotid salivary glands. It's kind of right along where the ear opening is, the external auditory meatus. And then we have the submandibular salivary glands. So we have three different sets of salivary glands. Of course, we have the tongue, which plays an instrumental role in digestion as well, because it mixes the food that we ingest with the saliva, which again contains amylase, and so it helps to moisten the food that we take in, making it easier to swallow. It also, again, contains amylase, and that enzyme helps break down carbohydrates. Well, the oral cavity is going to connect to the pharynx or the throat. And of course, we also have some other important structures in that area. We have the larynx, we have the trachea. The trachea, of course, is going to lead to the lungs, and we don't want food going down our lungs. So to keep the food routed down the esophagus and to keep only air going down the trachea to the lungs, we have what's called the epiglottis. And it's going to be a little flap that ultimately routes food down the esophagus and just allows air to go down the trachea. Okay, continuing down, we see the esophagus actually goes through the muscular diaphragm, and we know the diaphragm not only divides the abdominal cavity from the thoracic cavity, but it also is going to be important in changing the dimensions of our thoracic cavity and giving us the ability to inhale and exhale. From there, we're going to see the liver. It's such a large organ that it actually covers most of 2 quadrants. Okay, and then we see some other structures, of course. The esophagus is going to attach to the stomach. We can see the spleen over top of, or excuse me, underneath of the stomach, with the stomach over top of it. The spleen is going to be instrumental in our lymphatic and immune system. It's also going to help to take out worn out red blood cells. We also see the beginning of the small intestine. The small intestine is only called the small intestine because it's smaller in diameter. Okay, it's actually about 23 feet compared to the large intestine, which is around 7 feet. But we have, at the end of the stomach, we have the junction between the stomach and the first part of the small intestine. And the first part is called the duodenum. And then the middle portion is called the jejunum. And then the last part of the small intestine is the ileum. And the ileum connects with the large intestine, and they form the ileocecal valve. The very first part of the large intestine is called the cecum. And coming off the large intestine is the appendix. And from there we see the ascending colon. Ascending means upward, of course. Transverse colon, which goes across the small intestine. Then the descending colon. And then finally the last couple segments are the sigmoid colon and the rectum. And then the rectum is going to carry the fecal material is going to be carried from the rectum through the anal canal and the anal sphincters, which must relax before the fecal material can leave the rectum. Now, we also have accessory structures to digestion. Okay, here we can see the liver and how it pretty much completely covers the stomach. And there we can see the spleen also nestled behind the stomach. Okay, within the bend of the stomach in the first segment of the small intestine, we can see the pancreas. And in green there we can see superimposed underneath of the liver, where it would be hiding normally, is the gallbladder that's going to store bile, which is essential for the emulsification of fat. That means it helps to break down fat in our diet. Okay. Now this table just shows some of the organs of the digestive system. Okay, it gives the main organ and then accessory organs. And so in the mouth, or the oral cavity, we have accessory organs consisting of the teeth and tongue, the salivary glands, the parotid salivary gland, the submandibular salivary gland, and then the sublingual salivary glands. We have the pharynx or throat, then the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, which consists of the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Okay, our accessory organs at that point are the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Okay, the large intestine, which consists of the cecum, the colon, which consists of the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. And then the accessory organ in that area is the vermiform appendix. And then we have the rectum, and then finally the anal canal. Oops. Now, again, the primary mechanisms of the digestive system: ingestion. Okay, complex foods are taken into the GI tract, and of course that's going to be in the oral cavity. Digestion, a group of processes that break complex nutrients into simpler ones. Mechanical digestion, breakup of large chunks of food into smaller bits. Chemical digestion breaks large molecules into smaller ones. We have gastric motility, a number of GI movements resulting from muscular contraction. That muscular contraction, we're going to find out in a little while, is called peristalsis. And that peristalsis is going to be kind of like squeezing the toothpaste through a toothpaste tube. You start at the very end of the toothpaste tube, and then you push down with your thumbs, and the toothpaste goes forward just a little bit. And then you push down just a little bit farther in front of the end of the tube with your thumbs, and the toothpaste goes a little forward till finally it comes out the very end. Well, gastric motility is going to be similar to that. And we're going to see that rings of smooth muscle throughout the gastrointestinal tract move the food from the very beginning of the GI tract to the very end of the GI tract. Secretion is going to occur also in the GI tract. Secretion is a release of digestive juices and hormones that facilitate digestion. Absorption, movement of digested nutrients into the internal environment of the body. And then regulation, neurohormonal and other mechanisms that regulate digestive activity. For example, if I'm going to my car late at night after teaching night class and somebody jumps out of the shadows and says, "Give me your keys and give me your wallet," and my goal is to either run away from this person or I've got to stand there and fight, the hormone epinephrine is going to cause my heart rate to go up, my breathing to go up, and to make more blood carrying oxygen available to my working muscles that may need that extra oxygen to help me run faster or punch longer, I shunt blood away from my gastrointestinal system. Breaking down that Big Mac that I had for dinner isn't high priority when my life is on the line. So we're going to see that we have neural and hormonal mechanisms which help regulate the digestive activity going on in our body. And so here are the processes which occur. Ingestion is the process of taking food into the mouth, starting it on its journey through the GI tract. Digestion, a group of processes that break complex nutrients into simpler ones, thus facilitating their absorption. Mechanical digestion physically breaks large chunks into small bits. Chemical digestion breaks molecules apart. Motility, movement by the muscular components of the digestive tube, including processes of mechanical digestion. Examples include peristalsis and segmentation. Secretion, release of digestive enzymes containing release of digestive juices containing enzymes, acids, bases, mucus, bile, or other products that facilitate digestion. Some digestive organs also secrete endocrine hormones that regulate digestion or metabolism. Absorption, movement of digested nutrients through the GI tract mucosa and into the internal environment. Elimination, excretion of the residues of the digestive process, feces from the rectum through the anus, that's called defecation. And then regulation, coordination of digestive activity, motility, and secretion. So again, we would say that the digestive tract is described as a tube that extends from the mouth to the anus, but it's not just a hollow tube, and we're going to find out that inside of that tube are these finger-like projections called villi that are going to serve a tremendous purpose in increasing surface area and therefore increasing the ability of the GI tract to break food down, to absorb the nutrients, to absorb water, and make sure that only material that serves no purpose in the body or can't be digested is excreted with the waste material. The wall of the digestive tube is formed by 4 layers of tissue: the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. And the mucosa is the type varies depending on the GI location. It's tough and stratified, or delicate and simple epithelium. Okay, also produces mucus. The submucosa is a connective tissue layer. The muscularis, circular, longitudinal, and oblique and stomach layers of muscle important in GI motility. Peristalsis, wave-like movement, pushes food down the tract. Segmentation, back and forth movement of food. And then the serosa, the serous membrane that covers the outside of the abdominal organs. It attaches the digestive tract to the wall of the abdominopelvic cavity by forming folds called mesenteries. So this is basically a cross-section of our gastrointestinal tract, and here we can see the layers. Okay. And again, those layers are going to be the serosa, submucosa, mucosa, and muscularis. Okay. The mucosa is going to be our inner layer. Okay. The submucosa is going to be below the mucosa, hence the term sub, below the mucosa. Okay. There are mucus secreting glands in the submucosa. Then we have the muscularis. The muscularis layer is going to have circular and longitudinal muscle, and that's going to help with peristalsis, and what we're also going to have that's called segmentation, back and forth movement. Then we have the serosa. Okay, it's a connective tissue layer. Okay, and it's going to form the peritoneum. And then ultimately, the peritoneum is going to help anchor the digestive organs in our abdominal pelvic cavity and help form what are called the mesenteries, which are connective tissue as well as blood vessels and nerves that ultimately give stability to our gastrointestinal organs. We don't want to be walking up some stairs and have everything jostling around in our abdominal cavity, but also it's going to give the capability to have nourishment to those organs and nerve endings, which help supplement their effect, either enhancing it or slowing it down depending on what our body's needs are. Oops. So this is going to be peristalsis, and we're going to see that the food we have here, that green ball, is a bolus. Once the food gets broken down in our mouth and it makes its way into our stomach, well, we call it a bolus at that point, and then eventually as it makes its way through the stomach into the small intestine, it's more of a soupy-like material called chyme. And that chyme gets moved through the gastrointestinal tract when rings of muscular contraction by smooth muscle push it through the GI tract. Okay, and so here we can see that analogy that I used, the tube of toothpaste analogy, moving that bolus through the GI tract. Whoops. Now, here's segmentation, and here we see segmentation where we can actually move food back and forth, and that breaks it down into smaller and smaller pieces, which in turn gives us more surface area for enzymes to break down the nutrients and get those nutrients into our system, our bloodstream, so they can be carried to wherever they are needed. Okay, the mouth, of course, the oral cavity. The roof is formed by the hard palate. That's part of the maxillary and palatine bones and the soft palate. An arch-shaped muscle separating the mouth from the pharynx. The uvula, a downward projection of the soft palate. Okay, so there are our major structures of the oral cavity. Okay, we can see the hard palate and the soft palate. Okay, we can see the uvula hanging down. We can also see the palatine tonsils, okay, on the sides of the oral cavity. Okay, we see the tongue, which again plays an important role in the fact that it moves food around and helps lubricate it with the saliva that contains the enzyme amylase. Okay, we also have the sublingual salivary glands under the tongue. We see the different teeth, okay, in the oral cavity. Okay, we can see the central incisors, okay, our front teeth, the lateral incisors to the sides of our front teeth. Okay, then behind the lateral incisors, we have the canines or cuspids. Then we have the premolars and the molars. Now, if you'll look, you'll see there's a piece of skin called the frenulum, and that's what holds the tongue to the bottom of the mouth. Now, you'll also see on that diagram there to the side of the lingual frenulum, you'll see some veins, but one of the really important things to note about the area beneath the tongue is that that entire muscular tongue and the bottom of the mouth, because of the mucus, or excuse me, because of the saliva being secreted, that's a very good place for a lot of medications. Sublingual medications get into our system quite quickly because of the fact that it's richly vascular and the saliva breaks down medications quickly. And so a medication like nitroglycerin, which could be essential for helping somebody stave off a heart attack, gets into our system quickly and can dilate the coronary arteries fast and get life-giving blood to that myocardium. Now, we see in this diagram too, at the very back, okay, we call those the wisdom teeth, the third molar. We see our 6-year molar. Okay, so those are some of the teeth, the wisdom teeth especially are ones that oftentimes come in at odd angles and have to be taken out. We also see the sublingual salivary gland. We see the ductwork for that. And then we see the gingiva or the gums as well. Okay, so that's our oral cavity. And of course, that's where we take in our foodstuffs. That's where ingestion starts. Now, the teeth, we talked about the different names of the teeth, where they're located, but the teeth have 3 main parts: the crown, the neck, and the root. Okay, the enamel, which covers the crown, is the hardest tissue in the body. And here's our typical tooth. And we can see down here at the bottom we have bone, and that bone is going to be important because that is going to support the tooth and give it a socket with which to fill and make it strong. We have what's called cementum that helps hold the tooth in place, as well as the periodontal ligament and the periodontal membrane. Too keeps a tight seal in that area. Okay, here we see the root of the tooth that's going to have blood vessels, it's going to have nerve endings, and it's going to go into the bone that holds the tooth in place. Okay, then we see the neck. That's the part that is in the gingiva, the gums, and then above the neck we see the crown. And of course, that's going to be the area that's covered with that hard enamel, the hardest part of our body. The cusp is the top of the tooth with all of the ridges and grooves. Okay, the dentin is the pulpy material beneath that really hard enamel. Okay, the pulp cavity contains nerves and blood vessels. Okay, and there again we see the gingiva, the gums. Okay, we talked about our different types of teeth, the incisors, cuspids, bicuspids, and tricuspids. There are 20 teeth in a deciduous or baby set, and again, the name for baby teeth are deciduous teeth. The average age for cutting the first tooth is about 6 months, and the set is complete at about 30 months of age. There are 32 teeth in a permanent set. Okay, 6 years is about the average for starting to cut permanent teeth. The set's complete usually between the ages of 17 and 24. Now, staying in our oral cavity, our salivary glands, we have saliva, the exocrine gland secretion that flows into the ducts, and we have a serous type saliva that's watery and contains enzymes called salivary amylase, and the serous type has no mucus. It's produced by the serous type secretory cells. Then we have the mucus type of saliva, and it's thick and slippery and contains mucus but no enzymes. It lubricates the food during mastication. And mastication is the process of chewing. It's produced by mucus type secretory cells. And then finally we have the parotid salivary glands. Okay, they're the largest salivary glands. They produce a serous type saliva. If anybody's ever had the mumps, or maybe you've coded a chart for somebody that has mumps, then mumps are an infection of the parotid salivary glands. Okay, and there we see the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual salivary glands. Okay, and there we see at the bottom the serous cells. Then we have mucus cells. Okay, and we have different types of saliva, as it mentioned on the previous slide. Oops. The submandibular glands, they are a mixed gland. They produce a serous type and a mucus type of saliva. They're located below the mandibular angle. Okay, the mandible, of course, is the lower jawbone. The ducts open on either side of the lingual frenulum. We have the sublingual glands that produce only the mucus type saliva, and multiple ducts open into the floor of the mouth from that sublingual salivary gland. Okay. The pharynx, of course, layperson's name would be the throat. The anatomical components include the nasopharynx, where the nasal cavity connects with the pharynx. The oropharynx, where the oral cavity attaches to the pharynx. The laryngopharynx, where the larynx attaches to the pharynx. Okay, the oropharynx is the most involved segment in digestive processes of swallowing, or we can call swallowing deglutition. Regulation of deglutition movements by motor cortex of the cerebrum are voluntary, and the deglutition center of the brainstem takes care of the involuntary part of swallowing. Once we get food to the back of our throat at the very top of the oropharynx, then when we lift our tongue to the roof of our mouth, we swallow automatically. So there's a voluntary part, but then once it gets to a certain part and we lift our tongue to the roof of our mouth, it then becomes an involuntary action controlled by the brainstem. For example, I can chew gum as long as I want to chew it, and that is an activity associated with the cortex. But then when I decide I want to swallow that gum, which obviously we shouldn't do, but regardless, when you get it to the back of the throat, at the very edge of the oropharynx, when we raise our tongue to the roof of our mouth, we swallow automatically due to the activity of the brainstem. The esophagus connects the pharynx to the stomach. Okay, it's a dynamic passageway for food. Food enters the stomach by passing through the lower esophageal sphincter. It's also called the cardiac sphincter. So here we see the esophagus, and it is going to have an attachment to the stomach. The esophagus, again, went right through an opening in the diaphragm to get to the stomach. Then we have the gastroesophageal opening that's guarded by the lower esophageal sphincter. And again, sphincters are going to be rings of muscle which open and close like valves. Now, if we look at this model of our stomach, we see that we have three different layers of muscle. Okay, the muscularis, if we look to the right there, we see the muscularis, and we have the longitudinal muscle layer, the circular muscle layer, and the oblique muscle layer. Okay, those are going to be important because the stomach is going to churn its contents and mix it with hydrochloric acid and enzymes, and having those three different oriented muscle groups, that will allow the stomach to, for lack of a better way to put it, shake it all up and mix it up well, so ultimately everything gets mixed to give the greatest amount of surface area a chance to interact with the hydrochloric acid and enzymes associated with the stomach. Now, the upper portion of the stomach there, we can see that's called the fundus. Then we have the body of the stomach. The membrane that covers the stomach, it covers all of those muscular layers. It covers the inner layers called that we would refer to as the rugae. All of those are surrounded by the serosa. Okay, below the muscle layers, we have the submucosa and mucosa. Okay, of course, the mucosa is going to be the layer that actually comes in contact with our food, and that is where we see those ridges called the rugae. Think of the rugae as being like the folds on an accordion. An accordion can fit into a case that isn't very big, but when you pull that accordion out and stretch it, it stretches forever, it seems. And the same thing can be said of our stomach. Those rugae give it the ability to expand. So if you eat a big Thanksgiving meal, and you have to undo the top button on your pants and unhook your belt, well, that's because your stomach's expanding, and that expansion is due to the rugae. Now, we can see along the body of the stomach, we have a curvature called the lesser curvature. Okay. And then on the back side of the stomach from this angle, we see what's called the greater curvature. And those curvatures are going to lead into the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. The very last segment of the stomach is the pylorus. And the pylorus is going to keep the food in that stomach, and it's going to keep it in there with the help of the pyloric sphincter. This sphincter is located in the pylorus region, so that's why it's called the pyloric sphincter. And then we see the very first segment of the small intestine called the duodenum. Now, a couple things I want to mention. The esophagus, where it attaches to the stomach and has that sphincter of muscle called the lower esophageal sphincter, that oftentimes, if somebody has a big meal and then they go right to bed, well, the acidic contents of the stomach may push back up against that that lower esophageal sphincter, and that could result in the acidic contents of the stomach going up the esophagus, and that's what we typically think of as heartburn. Remember, another name for the lower esophageal sphincter is the cardiac sphincter because of its location. Well, the reason it's called heartburn is, again, people think, oh, my heart's on fire. Well, it's not that the heart's on fire. It's just that the location of the LES, or cardiac sphincter, is in that same general location. If those acidic contents come up the esophagus on a nightly basis, we don't just call it heartburn, which is something that happens here and there. We call that gastroesophageal reflux disorder, GERD. If it's something that's a nightly occurrence, well, then it's a different animal. Okay, that's where somebody might have to be on a long-term acid blocker like Protonix versus being able to take just a Malox or something because you had a large meal right before bed because you got home late from work and you just lay down. Okay, a one-time thing, you might take an antacid like Malox or Rolaids or Tums, but if somebody has it every night, that's where you get into the necessity of an acid blocker, again like Protonix or Nexium. Whoops. The small intestine, again, we saw where the stomach attached to the small intestine. The small intestine's about 20 feet long. I said 23 feet. Some texts will say that. But it's broken down into the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The reason, again, it's called the small intestine is because it's small in diameter, only about 2 centimeters. Okay. All right, so here's our small intestine. And if we look at the small intestine, we have all of these finger-like projections throughout the entire length of that muscular tube, and we call those the villi. And the villi are going to greatly increase the surface area that our foodstuff intermingles with, and so that gives it more time to come into contact with enzymes which break it down, but also the villi are going to be very vascular. They're going to have vessels associated with the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system, and that really helps to increase absorption and get those nutrients into our system. Larger molecules will be picked up by the lacteals of the lymphatic system, and smaller molecules can be picked up by the vessels of the cardiovascular system. But again, we see those 4 layers of the small intestine. Okay, the serosa, muscularis, submucosa, and mucosa. And again, this is going to be the same pattern that we see in terms of the makeup of our entire gastrointestinal system. The small intestine has walls that contain smooth muscle fibers that contract to produce peristalsis and segmentation movements. Again, forward movements and side-to-side movements. The lining, the mucosous membrane, has many microscopic glands, intestinal glands that secrete intestinal juice. The villi are those microscopic finger-shaped projections from the surface of the mucosa into the intestinal cavity that contain blood and lymph capillaries. Again, that's going to help increase the surface area of the small intestine. It's not just that our food shoots through our small intestine like a water ride at King's Dominion. It's going to go through there slowly and come into contact with many of those finger-like villi to increase the surface area for absorption of the nutrients. Okay, we come to the liver and the gallbladder. And the liver, again, is a large organ. It's the largest gland. It fills the upper right section of the abdominal cavity and extends over into the left side. Okay, the liver secretes bile. Okay, there are multiple ducts associated with the liver. The hepatic duct, which drains bile from the liver. The cystic duct is the duct by which bile enters and leaves the gallbladder. Then there's the common bile duct. It's formed by the union of the hepatic and cystic ducts. It drains bile from the hepatic or cystic ducts into the duodenum. Okay, and so here we can see the ducts associated with the liver, and in close proximity, of course, we see the gallbladder, and how ultimately the ducts are going to lead into the first segment of the small intestine. Okay, so there we see the duodenum, and we can see how those ducts are going to lead their way into the first segment of the small intestine, and that bile is going to be imperative for emulsifying fat so it can be broken down. The gallbladder, again, is located on the undersurface of the liver. Its function is it concentrates and stores bile produced by the liver. Okay. There we can see from this picture too that we have the pancreas, how it is going to be in the fold of the stomach and the small intestine. Okay, the pancreas is an exocrine gland that lies behind the stomach. Okay, its functions, its pancreatic cells secrete pancreatic juice, which is the most important digestive juice. People think of the pancreas as just secreting insulin and glucagon to regulate sugar levels in our bloodstream, but it is also important in the process of digestion. Okay. The main pancreatic duct empties into the duodenum. And again, the pancreas does have the pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans, which the cells are not connected with, the cells are not connected with pancreatic ducts. It secretes hormones, glucagon, and insulin into the blood. Okay, so those hormones get secreted into the bloodstream. Okay, the large intestine is divided into the cecum, and then what we refer to as the colon, the ascending, transverse, descending, and the sigmoid rectum. Food enters through the ileocecal valve. Okay, again, that is the very first segment of this large intestine where it connects with the last segment of the small intestine. The ileum, the last section of the small intestine. The cecum, the first segment of the large intestine. Okay, and a sphincter guards that opening, the ileocecal valve. The external opening of the large intestine is referred to as the anus. The wall, again, contains smooth muscle fibers that contract to produce the churning peristalsis that leads to defecation. And the lining is a mucous membrane. So here we can see the large intestine. We can see the blood supply as well off of the descending aorta there in red. And again, our digestive system is going to have a high metabolic rate. And so ultimately, the cells of the digestive system are going to need nourishment. Okay, but also absorption is going to be high priority as well throughout our gastrointestinal system. But here we can see the first segment of the large intestine and its attachment to the last segment of the small intestine, the ileum, and there's the cecum. And then the little worm hanging off of the cecum, of course, is the appendix. And then we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, which crosses over the small intestine, and then the descending colon with the segment at the bottom called the sigmoid colon leading into the rectum. And then we have the anal sphincters, which keep fecal material in the rectum until it's time to defecate. The appendix is a blind tube off of the cecum. There's no important digestive functions in a human. The peritoneum, okay, it's a continuous serous membrane lining the abdominal cavity and covering abdominal organs. The parietal layer of the peritoneum lines the abdominal cavity. The visceral layer, visceral is going to pertain to the organs. Viscero means organs, so visceral means pertaining to the organs. So the visceral layer of the peritoneum actually is the part of this membrane that comes into contact with the abdominal organs. It covers the abdominal organs. The peritoneal space lies between the parietal and visceral layers. Okay, so you can think of, if this is an organ of digestion, the part that's actually in touch with the organ of digestion, we refer to that as the visceral peritoneum. This part up here would be the parietal peritoneum. The space between the parietal and the visceral, that's what we refer to as the peritoneal space. Okay, the extensions of the peritoneum are referred to as the mesentery and the greater omentum. The mesentery is an extension of the parietal peritoneum, which attaches most of the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. Again, we've got 20 some odd feet of coiled up small intestine. We can't have it jostling around. So we have to attach it, in this case, to the posterior abdominal wall, the back of the abdominal wall. The greater omentum, or the lace apron, hangs down from the lower edge of the stomach and transverse colon over the intestines. Okay, X-ray studies of the GI tract use radio opaque contrast medium to help visualize structure to study. Okay, and so here are some X-rays of the GI tract using that radio opaque material. Now, digestion transforms food into substances that can be absorbed and used by cells. Ultimately, we have to break down the food that we take in into protein, carbohydrates, fats, vitamins, minerals, and water. We can't just have little bits of Big Mac floating around in our bloodstream. It doesn't work that way. We've got to take that Big Mac and break it down. The patty into protein and fat, the bun into carbohydrates, the lettuce and tomato into carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, water, all of that would be in that particular sandwich. We have to break it down into those components, and those components get used to build new structures or repair structures, to catalyze enzymatic reactions and such. Mechanical digestion is chewing, or as we said, that's mastication. Swallowing is deglutition. And peristalsis breaks food into tiny particles. It mixes them well with digestive juices and moves them along the digestive tract. Chemical digestion breaks up large food molecules into compounds that have smaller molecules brought about by digestive enzymes. Enzymes and chemical digestion. Enzymes are specialized protein molecules that act as catalysts. They speed up the breakdown of the various foodstuffs in our body. Okay, the breakdown process is called hydrolysis. The enzyme plus water, that's where we get the term hydrolysis. Lyse is to break down. Hydro means water.
Professor Bernard, I have a question.
Sure.
So what happens when someone eats, they're eating, ingesting the food, when it doesn't break down, it gets stuck?
Some people may have a lack of enzymes. They may have a lack of gastric motility. That's not unusual either. If that's the case, they may have to be given something to increase gastric motility. They may also have to be put on a liquid diet so they don't have to digest the food. They would, in some cases, if the food can't be moved through the GI tract and it would just rot, for lack of a better way to put it, they may have to do a surgical procedure to eliminate what got trapped in the GI system. But chances are they would be able to give them something to increase gastric motility and move the foodstuffs along, or get them to regurgitate it, or even potentially speed up water entering into the GI system and get it out that way through the large intestine and sigmoid colon and rectum.
Is that the same thing for like when a person is ingesting food and then, it hurts going down the digestive tract?
It could be. It could be due to a lack of gastric motility. The peristaltic waves aren't moving the food through their GI system, so it very well could be related to that. The pain could be due to nerve endings. Again, the GI tract is richly innervated with nerve endings, and so it very well might have something to do with the GI tract having sensitive nerves, and the stretching of those nerves as food goes down the GI tract causes the patient pain. But more than likely it's going to be due to a lack of sufficient gastric motility moving the food along.
Okay. And one last question. Melissa had a question about the slides. The PowerPoint, the slides that you were showing with the x-ray like that. Can you send those slides to us?
Sure. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Because like on the book and stuff that we have that we were looking at and going by, you're like pulling, like you said, like the meat and potatoes out of it. So you made a PowerPoint of that.
Right.
Is there any way that you can like send that PowerPoint to us?
Sure, by all means. Yeah, like I said, since I'd already created some videos and you had all those resources from the publisher and everything, I thought I would just shake things up a little bit. I'm sure everybody's been using those pretty regularly, and this would just kind of give you another perspective, a summary synopsis, so to say, of everything that we've covered with the videos and with the other resources from the publisher. But sure, I can send all this. Yeah. Okay. Now, continuing with digestion, we've got to get this food broken down so we can get it absorbed. Carbohydrate digestion takes place mainly in the small intestine. Pancreatic amylase, again, with the amylase that's in our mouth, is going to help break down carbohydrates. It breaks down polysaccharides into disaccharides. Poly just means many, and saccharide just means chains of sugar. So very long chains of sugar. And we're going to break it down into, with the help of pancreatic amylase, we're going to break it down into molecules that just have two sugar chains. Di means two. So we have various intestinal juice enzymes. Maltase changes maltose to glucose. Sucrase changes sucrose to glucose. Lactase changes lactose to glucose. When people don't have the enzyme lactase, they can't break down lactose, so we say those people, of course, are lactose intolerant. Protein digestion. It starts in the stomach. It's completed in the small intestine. The gastric juice enzyme pepsin partially digests proteins. Pancreatic enzyme trypsin continues with the digestion of protein. And then the intestinal enzymes peptidases complete the digestion of partially digested proteins and converts them into amino acids. Amino acids are going to be the building blocks of protein. So to get protein into our system and use it, we've got to break it all the way down with the help of pepsin, trypsin, and peptidases into amino acids. Okay. Finally, we have fat digestion. Bile contains no enzymes but emulsifies fat. It breaks fat droplets into very small droplets. If you've ever put a roast in the refrigerator and left it overnight and then you take the lid off the next morning, you see all that fat accumulates and comes to the surface. Well, that's kind of what bile does. That's called emulsification. When you see what happens to your roast in the broth overnight, well, bile does the same thing. And then it helps break those fat molecules down into ever smaller droplets that can be more easily digested and absorbed. Pancreatic lipase changes emulsified fats to fatty acids and glycerol in the small intestine. Those are forms of fat that we can use. Now, we've broken everything down. That's digestion. We've got to absorb it. So the definition is the process by which digested food moves into the intestine, into blood or lymph. Foods and most water, minerals, and vitamins are absorbed from the small intestine. Some water and vitamin K are also absorbed in the large intestine. Okay. Surface area absorption. The structural adaptations increase absorptive surface area. And then fractal geometry is a study of fragmented geometric irregular shapes such as those in the lining of the intestine. And that helps us to understand how absorption occurs due to the increased surface area of the gastrointestinal tract, permitting so much more of the foodstuffs that have been broken down to have contact with the enzymes, but also to have contact with the lacteals and the vessels of the cardiovascular system, and therefore enhancing absorption. Oh, that was my last slide. Okay, very good, very good. Any questions on this? I knew it would take right about an hour, and that's where we were.